Hello there. Having now walked halfway across Tokyo to the other side of it, I'm taking a little break by this picturesque river surrounded by seagulls for some reason. I hope that they're enjoying it as much as I am. Last night I was looking through Netflix for something to watch, and I stumbled upon a very old title from the 80s that I'd seen on the shelf of every video rental store ever, but never gotten around to watching because it looked like a very kind of mindless action flick with no particularly redeeming features whatsoever. The movie in question was Cobra, starring Sylvester Stallone. Now, a quick breakdown of the story is that he is a cop that don't play by the rules, but he gets the job done. You know, it's probably one of the best examples of movies in that genre. But looking at it as we do now from 2021, it's interesting to reflect with a historian's eye on why that kind of movie was so popular in the 80s and why so many of them existed. Simple truth is that since sometime in the 60s, a silent cultural war has been going on in the West, where a system of values that had stood the test of time were being one by one replaced by values based on pixie dust and questionable intent. I'm not going to go into too much detail as to what those values are, but if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you probably grew up with the new system. By the mid-80s, it was becoming increasingly evident that this was happening, and so movies like Cobra exist to provide a counter-narrative. So Sylvester Stallone's character is kind of the embodiment, a caricature even, of all of these old values. And not only does he revel in them, he utterly demolishes the new value system as he does it. And you know, he's the hero of an action movie, so we have to cheer along with him. You know, not quite realizing that we're accepting the old system, the old values, and rejecting the new. We don't quite know why we're cheering him on, because it doesn't seem right, but at the same time it does. This is how the cultural war works. It's all propaganda. So this is, yeah, counter-propaganda, you could call it. It's used a lot of very now cheesy 80s ballads and love anthems, which gave it a kind of a wholesome feel to it, to say, yeah, this is a family movie extolling positive values in this imperfect package. Well, I'm back from my walk now. It ended up being about 25 kilometers rather than miles, and a lot of that was due to a very silly mistake. I'd used my wallet to prop up my camera when I made the last video and accidentally left it there by the river. I didn't discover it until about a mile later, so I had to backtrack and go and fetch it. Thankfully, this being Japan, it was exactly where I'd left it with all of the contents intact. Still, it was a very stupid thing to do, so I'm officially berating myself on video for the public record. Enjoy! Now, I talked about the Western paradigm shift in social values that occurred from about the late 60s onwards, and it probably sounds like a lot of conspiracy theory, hoax nonsense. But the problem is that if you grew up in the late 60s onwards, then you would have been indoctrinated into that system. So I certainly was. And given how successful the propaganda had been, that you know, especially nowadays even, you look at the depictions of the before times, and they're kind of shown as being this very dark era of backwards values that's better left in the garbage dump of history. Of course, contemporary television and movies at the time weren't like that at all, but that's how people are remembering it. So, of course, we have the modern progressive value system because no other system makes sense. Or does it? My life in Japan has spanned 4 decades now, and one thing that became very immediately apparent quite early on is that paradigm shift in values never happened here. But instead, we've seen real social change over the time I've been here. Actual progress, all via the natural evolution of traditional values, and without really changing any of the core components. And the result of that is a thriving 21st century first world country Very little in the way of divisiveness. People are on the same page. The social contract works. People are polite to each other. It's just a great place to live. So what's always interesting to look at is young Westerners, when they come to live out here, they see this thriving nation that hasn't embraced their Western sensibilities, and it does their heads in. They just can't work out how that could be possible. And then they conclude that it isn't possible, that that society here is a lie, it's a house of cards that's going to come crumbling down with the slightest provocation. They plead to their friends to adopt their value system, and nobody wants it. Japan's doing just fine. And when viewed from that perspective, the paradigm shift that occurred in the West is just so obvious. It makes you wonder how anybody missed it. And of course, they didn't miss it, which is why films like Cobra exist. And I mean, you can see the same thing in Star Wars, which the original movie was made in 1977, or released in 77 anyway, where the paradigm shift was still in its early stages. And it was perfectly acceptable for Han Solo, sensing his life was in danger, to shoot Greedo first. But fast forward 20 years to the special editions, society had changed significantly, and now defending your own life was not acceptable. So they had to have Greedo shoot first. And the fact that that actually generated so much conflict really shows that the traditional values are still taking a hold. They're in there, but they're fighting a losing battle. But it's countries like Japan where the traditional values have succeeded, and we have a perfectly good 21st century country here that show that it can be done.